Vince,
Wait, I'm cutting you off for 1 second. Another thing that needs to be brought up the fact is that you guys need to encourage Steve to run for state bar president. I'll leave that right there, and he can answer that later.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, Councilman. We're live. It's November 4th, 2020. We are moving through a most unusual year. However, we're taking this uniqueness and we are collaborating from law enforcement. We're collaborating from the legal world. We're collaborating from Black and white. We're collaborating from citizens to those who protect citizens. And today we're continuing on a couple of issues that I think you hear a lot of. We will look to Doug as his chief. Former Austin Police Chief Art Acevedo had made comments in regards to defunding, which we have had at least a couple discussions about, and how the political world has affected these things. We've come together as groups so that we can depoliticize the things that we do here. Yes, sir, we have, and yes, ma'am, we have Council Member Rudy Mateer, and congratulations to him. But he is the chair of the African American Lawyers section of the State Bar of Texas, and he is definitely an integral part of interfacing with law enforcement and the agencies we have across the state. We also want to bring up a topic as I look to Doug Griffith from the Houston area about the difference between a bad policeman or woman and bad policing, and the differences between the two. Let's start there, Doug, because I think Chief Acevedo is a guy that's got a lot of followers, and that is a political sense. But because we are trying to stay out of that realm, let's start with the other scenario, which I think a lot of citizens probably need to hear this discussion to recognize what law enforcement does when there's a bad policeman or woman, and the differences and where bad policing has its genesis.
Yes, sir. Well, again, the things you have to look at is the difference between policing versus the police officer. You got to separate the two, because a lot of times, or 99% of the time, the officer's acting upon how they're trained and the policies that are enacted within their department. Again, I'm going to bring up the Philadelphia incident that happened last week with the gentleman with the knife. The officers backed up. The guy come at him and they shot him. The family attorney wanted to know, he did not believe those officers should be indicted. They were working with the tools that they had and the training that they had, and he felt the department didn't do enough to equip those officers with the proper tools they needed to be able to handle that situation. And so when you look at it, there's going to be those out there going, oh, those are horrible policemen. They shot that guy. He only had a knife. Well, I'm sorry, you can't bring a knife to a gunfight. I understand the guy had issues, completely understand that. But how do you deal with that on a level that a police officer is trained a certain way? They didn't have tasers. They didn't have pepper spray. They had nothing else but their firearm. The guys coming at them, they have no other choice. So some people go, oh, there's a bad policeman. I disagree. And apparently the family's attorney disagrees. They believe it's bad policing. A lot of times this bad policing comes from the top. It's in policies, it's in procedures, it's in training. Training is a big component of any of the issues that you see with these departments nowadays.
And let me add,
that's where we go. And we're talking about,
Yeah.
Taking away money from departments, because the first place they take away from, as we've discussed in the past, is training. The very first thing that goes when we're having a bad tax year or this or that, the first thing that goes is training. Unless it's mandatory training that you have to keep your certificate or your license or whatnot, everything else, man, it goes out the door, because they have to distribute the money appropriately to be able to cover, what we have to do. We have to have officers on the street. We have to have certain things going, and the money we have to, new cars or just repairing our vehicles that we have because they run 24 hours a day, stuff like that.
Also want to, not only do we have departments out there that still don't have intermediate force option. If you take away money, you take away those options as well. But also we have gotten away from teaching cops hand-to-hand combat. So we've taken away that force option as well. cops are no longer allowed to use their fists or their hands, as use of force tactics to inflict pain. We've gotten away from that altogether. So if you've taken away all of your intermediate force options, you've got talking to them and shooting them, nothing in between.
So Kevin, can you articulate, expand on why that's no longer taught? Is there a reason for that?
Well,
because it
is taught. A lot of that's going to depend on the department.
It does, but a lot of departments have gotten away from it altogether. The last I heard, DPS was actually still teaching boxing techniques and stuff in their academy, even though they've had a couple of tragic accidents in there. But a lot of departments have created policies where they do not want you to go hands-on at all because it looks bad. You cannot hit somebody with a uniform cop cannot hit somebody with their fist without it looking bad when somebody is standing over there taking a photograph or a video. It just always looks bad. But then I don't know how you shoot somebody without it looking bad.
So Rudy, you're looking at situations where the political subdivisions have given you really an A, and that A is no intermediate step. It is from verbal, if you're smooth and how you do it. And again, you don't know the mental capacity, and we lawyer on mental states of intent, knowingly, willingly. But if someone is mentally unstable and you're coming at them in a reasonable fashion, and funding and training says either you speak to them and they put the knife down, or you go to your sidearm weapon, because there are no in-betweens. Again, I think the citizens need to recognize, if you, and I'm going to jump to that next topic, if you're defunding agencies, then you take away taser, you take away different types of training depending on police or law enforcement agencies' abilities to put their officers in the best way to then, I guess, I don't want to, and correct me all if I'm wrong, to de-escalate the situation so you don't have to use that sidearm or firearm.
So Steve, let me. I don't mean to cut you off, but I want to get back to what Kevin was saying, which I thought was really interesting. I think this is important that people aren't cognizant of and are aware. You said that one of the reasons that was taken away was because of the optics, that it just doesn't look good with that as well. One, I'd be surprised if citizens even are cognizant of that. Two, I think they would be surprised to hear that law enforcement is worried about the optics and something like that, as just like you said, just opposed to having to use, a deadly weapon with that. Three, how do we change that narrative? Because obviously, as Stephen just said, you have to go from 0 to 100 and you can't stop at 50 anytime in there as well. It won't work, and it's not helping with that. And, optics, I get that, but you know what would you rather have?
Well, let me ask you as a city council member, which one worries you more? Public impression? Let's say I'm a Pflugerville police officer and I'm involved in a scenario and I decide the best course of action to me is hand-to-hand combat, and I don't only use open-handed strikes. I go to my elbow, which, by the way, elbow is a very effective intermediate force option. Are you more worried about the public perception of how that's going to look when that video or those photographs get out? Or are you more worried about how they're going to look in a civil courtroom when the city of Pflugerville is being sued because of that use of force that I made?
So I would say that I'd give you option 3. I'm more worried that you're not able to go ahead and actually utilize either of those and have to go ahead and pull out a sidearm instead on that. And ultimately, that is the issue that we're seeing over and over again. And that's the part that we need to, this is another reason why I love doing this, because it educates us as well as the public on these things. But that's a conversation that needs to be had, is that if I'm worried about getting a lawsuit on behalf of our city because a officer used hand-to-hand combat over here as well. Well, what the argument would be is that, wait a minute, okay, that was the least amount of force necessary to go and sue the person. And I would just oppose it to what's been going on with using a sidearm or side piece or anything else over there with that, because that's the justification, right? It may not look good, but you're trying your best to use the least amount of force necessary. And that's what
Rudy, what we're seeing around the country from a number of different cities, me and Stephen touched on this briefly after you all had left last week, is that a lot of the city councils and commissioners courts and stuff like that are removing those options. You know, they're removing the use of, you know, tear gas, or there are a number of these different options, or whether it's riot control or whatever. And if you remove those options, you limit what we can do. And eventually, if something has to happen, you know, then we're down to, you know, whatever options we have left.
And Rudy, I think when it comes to our elected officials and how they look at these things, and I'm going to ask Doug and Travis both to comment on this. Policies are being handed down based upon the optics that we just talked about. Look at the accreditation systems that are out there. Look at CALEA, look at the Texas Police Association. We got policy manuals that are this thick, and 90% of those policies are put there to avoid civil lawsuits.
Say the two organizations again. I didn't hear them clearly, and people.
CALEA is one of the big nationwide law enforcement accreditation systems, and somebody else will have to tell you exactly what CALEA stands for. But it's a private entity it's very popular among some of our law enforcement agencies. Look there. There's all the CALEA manuals on Doug's desk right there.
Okay.
And then there's
that's just our general orders. Just our general orders.
So, and by the way, they're written in such a way that in any given circumstance, I don't care what Doug does, which option he chooses, he will have violated at least 3 or 4 of those policies.
Yep,
they're just
guaranteed
on purpose. So the policies are written and set up to avoid the civil suits, to give the city some defense, and not to actually affect good public safety. Because like I said, sometimes effective public safety just looks bad.
Yep.
There's no way of making it look good. You cannot put lipstick on that pig, no pun intended.
Yep.
So when we're talking about those general orders, there is no way we can remember all of that stuff in those books, and, you know, in a moment's instance on what's occurring right then and there. Now, there's a lot of times we can stop and go look up, okay, yeah, we're supposed to handle things this way. But when the world's falling apart, and not only do we have the general orders, then we have your standard operating procedures, depending on the division that you're in, on top of that. So that's another set of books like that you then have to remember as well. And
so let me give you the perception that, and I even have some of this in question, as a Black American, and again, I had a discussion about this as it was yesterday was election night. Why aren't we all just Americans? We kind of decided to do what we did for whatever census purposes or what have you. I don't have the genesis exactly of that. When people see the reports of, and I'll use my own hometown of El Paso that has gone through a horrific 20+ killed citizens at a Walmart, that offender is alive, who has taken almost 24 lives. But a Black American who was supposedly offending some way, somehow, is now deceased, has not killed anyone, was supposedly resisting, and again, their outcome is RIP. I think when you talk about whether it's the training, the spur of the moment actions, what those officers see, I think a big question is, why is the Black offender dead? And again, the non-Black offender is in custody awaiting.
I'm taking that one on because I take exception to the characterization. But
what I'm saying is that is out there being characterized and being a part of the lightning rod that you would see. And I would say, I have to think about what some of that is being said on both sides of the coin. But this, again, should be the proper forum because we're not politically motivated. We can have this discussion. And again, I feel very comfortable in having that being answered by you or anyone else here.
I agree, but in order to have that conversation, we have to challenge the premise of the question. It's anecdotal.
Sure. Okay.
And I could give you 2 other anecdotes that will show exactly the opposite. I'd love to go back to a study that Rudy sent to me several months ago, done by, and it was headed up by an economist at Harvard, an African-American economist at Harvard. And I think they also teamed up with University of Massachusetts, University of Michigan. I don't recall, but Anyway, they looked at police use of force, particularly deadly force cases, on a nationwide basis. And it was very fascinating because what they did was they compared similar circumstances. They didn't go just with the frequency distributions. They looked at similar circumstances. What was the type of call for service? Was it officer initiated? Was the individual resisting? Was the individual wanted? Was the individual armed, and so on and so forth? And then they compared similar circumstances, but different races. So white suspect and a set of circumstances matched up to a black suspect, similar circumstances, versus Hispanic suspect, similar circumstances.
I'm going to take it. I'm going to take, Kev, I'm going to say this: one race, different ethnicities. I've been saying that though all year. Well, it's the human race. but I apologize for the interruption.
Again, we're talking about semantics there, but this is the way it's broken down when we talk about our UCR reports and so on and so forth. But what they found was that officers are actually less likely to force against the Black Americans in similar circumstances than they are against either Hispanic or white. Okay. However, in less than lethal circumstances, they found that officers are more likely to use less lethal force, okay, non-lethal force against African Americans than they are against white Americans, Hispanic Americans. Okay. So those kinds of results bear a lot more research, a lot more looking into, because then we have to start talking about what are the dynamics, what's causing that. Is it possible that the less lethal, that the lethal force is being impacted by cops being accused of being racist, and therefore they're hesitating that extra split second? They're not doing their jobs properly because the individual is African American. And is it possible that African Americans, having been taught, having been preached that cops are out to get them, are more likely to resist, and that's why the less than lethal force is used more often against them? I'm not saying that is the case. I'm saying those are possibilities that need to be looked into. We've got to quit being superficial in the way we read the data.
No, I agree, but nobody's going to dig into that for the right reasons.
Agreed.
All you're going to hear is the political speak, or you're going to get the news at the 5, the 6, and the 10 that say.
Let me also point this out. According to that study and several others, the use of force is almost universally consistent whether the officer is white, black, or Hispanic. So the ethnicity of the officer does not impact the use of force. But
Stephen, in your scenario there, I mean, every single when we show up at whatever call for service it is, what's happening at the time is what we have to deal with. How that offender's acting, what's going on, that type of stuff. So every scenario is different and ends in different ways. So there's no way to really predict what's going to happen, depending on the officer, depending on the offender, depending on what's happening.
So Travis, the only thing I would add is that one of the things that was really interesting when I worked at Health and Human Services was it's analogous to the extent that when you had who was being removed from DFPS from homes, right there, even if it was a Black or Hispanic counselor, a child of color was more likely to be removed, even if you go ahead and you hold all the different merits and statistics, and solely the only thing that was a defining difference between a child being removed or not was based on race. And I think that it goes to more, I mean, again, I hate it when I hear people talk about, they think systemic racism is like some guy with a mustache coming around, yes, I'm destroying the world, or something like that. I'm trying to do anything like that as well. I think it just goes with biases. And honestly, I'm not too surprised to hear that if it's a Black or Hispanic officer with, et cetera, right there having the same outcomes, because I think that some of those things come with the biases that go with it, which I'm going to be blunt. I don't think the media helps. I think it only helps perpetuates these things with that as well. And it goes with that. I'm not necessarily, I think I am very concerned when I hear people, and this is maybe your point, Kevin, is that when I'm saying that people go into law enforcement to screw and kill Black and brown people. I just don't, that's not something that I'm sure. Do we have some folks like that? Absolutely. I'm sure there's people out there. But do they make up the majority of the people out there in the States? No, absolutely not. So we need to look at, okay, what are the other circumstances that are coming into these discussions and how this comes about? I mean, I'm telling you, for me, I'm going to go back after this meeting and go talk to my city manager and say, okay, what are we talking about? The use of hand-to-hand combat. Is that something that's being, you know, are we being taught there? Because that's something to me, I'm thinking to myself, what can I do to help temper down things, not make permanent, you know, permanent deadly changes to a situation? And and Travis, you said it, if we're not allowing for a tool set, a broad tool set to be utilized, well, at some point, what tools do you have made available? And then Doug shows you know, geez, I don't even know what I want to call that, a treatise, an encyclopedia, things that you'll learn with that. I completely get that is true. Now, some of that comes with, because law enforcement, you have wide discretion, and therefore with wide discretion comes strong, you know, responsibility and, you know, regarding how you act and how you conduct things. But at the same time, if we're doing things for PR purposes and not truly what's in the best interest of people and trying to help them, and if that's what you're saying that you're hearing from council members, of course, you know, this is what I'm hearing from you right now. I'll talk to my staff and everything else from that as well. That really bothers me. That bothers me a lot. And it goes into, again, what do we value in this country? Do we value people's lives? Do we value what looks good? You know, that's.
Well, and let me make sure I point this out to you, Rudy. I don't mean to make it sound like council members are bad people or that city managers or chiefs of police are bad.
Oh, it's too late now. It's too late now.
No, we're not. I think what they don't understand is they're applying their own learned behaviors. They're saying, why, like Joe Biden said, why can't you shoot him in the leg? You know, why do you have to always shoot to kill? It's not what's going on. But if you don't take the time to stop and actually understand it, de-escalation works great when you're talking to reasonable, rational human beings. Unfortunately, very often, what we're asking people like Travis and Doug to do is deal with people that are incapable of rational, reasonable behavior, especially in that moment. And the cops are being asked, okay, you need to de-escalate. You need to find some way of dealing with this person's mental illness or whatever their mental state is at that moment without the tools, without the background, without knowing the first thing about that individual. We're putting these cops in an impossible position, and then we're judging them because they couldn't find a miracle cure.
So defunding doesn't lend to more training, proper tools in the toolbox to address these citizens during highly stressful times to de-escalate a situation. But again, I have to go back and I will say it seems, and again, media picks certain examples and they could be exceptional items, but it seems to me that you'll see a white assailant make it through after there's been a situation of death, and it seems like there may be a minority male that doesn't make it through. Again,
you just don't hear about the cases where law enforcement is where we're being forced to shoot and kill people that are not African American. 75%, 76% year in and year out of the people who die in encounters with law enforcement are not African American, but you don't hear about those.
And I'll give you an example. In Houston, in the last couple of weeks, we've had 2 officer-involved shootings, okay? One, the guy killed his girlfriend's baby, was shooting at her. The officer shot him. They put the race of the suspect and the officer. Officer's white, suspect black. Just Saturday night, we had one of our African-American female officers shoot a guy who was Hispanic. Did not put any race of anyone out there in that report. 0. Because it doesn't fit the narrative
in the media
of what the media likes to do. We have to get a hold of the media and say, stop perpetuating this. If an officer shot somebody, who cares what color he is? He had a gun, period. It doesn't matter what color you are. If you come out with a gun, you're going to get shot by police more than likely. And people have to understand it. We don't give a damn what color you are. All we care about is going home at the end of the night. And I'm going to do whatever I got to do that. So whether you're black, white, Hispanic, I don't care if you're an alien. You come at me with a gun, I'll plan on going home that night.
That's one of the good things that the grand jury has done, at least up in my area there, Stephen, is that when you have to go in front of a grand jury to read the case, or to read the charges against an individual. They do not allow you to say what race the suspect is. They're solely there to look at the evidence of the crime.
And I know grand juries are kind of built in a certain way. It's definitely the prosecutor talking to that grand jury. Again, I certainly appreciate that, because I think that is the continuum of what happens at that incident in the street, be it Philadelphia, be it in Wisconsin, or what have you, in Texas. But I think the thing about bad policing, I think bad policing is going to cover all ethnicities in your force, because you're not getting the proper training. So again, whether it matters if you're or ride along with me or Travis or whomever, if we're not properly trained, that's a different scenario altogether than a bad policeman or policewoman who has malintent.
Yes, and understand, most departments do not train tactically. They don't have the tactical training needed in some of these scenarios.
So tell people what tactical is defined as, Doug.
Tactical, let's say an active shooter, or an armed suspect, a barricaded suspect, chase policies, use of force. A lot of times they sit you in a classroom, they tell you what to do, there's no practical training on it. None. So, and that
so it's like if
very...
you told me, hey, this is how you're supposed to hit Justin Verlander's 90-some-mile-an-hour fastball. You have this thing called a bat. You'll stand 60 feet, 6 inches away. He's going to throw the ball. Someone's going to catch it. Now, he may not just throw you that fastball, but when that comes, it's probably around 92 miles an hour. Your idea is to get the bat out there across the plate and send it anywhere from 240 to 475 feet.
Right.
And Stephen,
so have fun when you get to Minute Maid.
And with the COVID, that's made it even worse, because we can't be in close contact with people to do the close contact training that we need to do. Yeah. I tell you what's systemically wrong, and that's, as you mentioned, the training and the lack of support for that training to ensure that the officers, the law enforcement agencies, are properly equipped to interface with the citizens that they are responsible for.
And I'm going to let Kevin answer this, Kevin or Travis. On these smaller agencies, how many of them, for HPD, we're a big agency, we have in-house training, all that good stuff. Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, the bigger agencies have this. How many law enforcement officers are there in the state of Texas, and how many of them have actually had any type of tactical training outside the academy?
There's 2,700 law enforcement agencies in the state of Texas, and my guess is that less than 300 of them have had any type of tactical training at all for any of their officers. But you have to remember, vast majority of those agencies have fewer than 10 officers total, and those officers are expected to go out and get their own training. There is no organized training program being put on by those agencies.
Hold on. They're supposed to just go find it?
Yes. They're required by law, by the way, to go find it. The agency is not required to provide the training. The officer is required to get the training in order to maintain their license to be a peace officer.
Well, Steve, that's not too dissimilar from, lawyers. I mean,
but lawyers aren't dealing with lives in tactical scenarios. I understand getting CLE, but I don't see CLE for you and me as lawyers on the same level as someone who needs to get training.
This is where I push back. What did you say, Kevin? Did you say how many law enforcement agencies in Texas?
2,700.
All right, 2,700. So how many of those actually have, and this is where, and this is a frank discussion. This is a discussion that Travis has brought up, Kevin and Doug, and I think Fred brought this up as well. Asking the legislature to put their money where their mouth is that most of these places, this gets paid out of our coffers. The citizens are paying for this. And if you were talking about lowering taxes, as we have put a cap on, this is the consequences. Elections have consequences. So you put a cap on what the actual applicable rate is, you're 0.5%. So anyone who's trying to get some funding or anything else to pay for that training because they think their officers should get that, what do you cut in the budget for that?
Agreed. And by the way, when you're talking about training for, continuing education for attorneys and doctors and hairdressers and whatever, that's individual training. That is how do you provide services to your customers one-on-one, maybe in small groups. Okay. It has nothing to do with whether or not you've got a situation that happens in Pflugerville this afternoon, and you've got Pflugerville Police Department, plus the constable's office, plus the Travis County Sheriff's Department, plus DPS, all responding at the same time. And officers from 4 or 5 different agencies have no ability to coordinate because they haven't trained to coordinate their response.
Yep.
And how about if it's in a school district? We had a situation in Deep East Texas last week where school district officers were putting on some sort of a training mock scenario, didn't tell any of their law enforcement agencies. And all of a sudden we get a call of a masked man trying to break into a school, and every cop in the county is headed that way.
Yeah.
It's just, so that's why training for law enforcement has to be different than any other profession out there.
Yes. That's why I'm surprised that you just say go do it on your own. Because again, Doug, we had the conversation, I think it was last week, about having the rookie cop not be with the more seasoned veteran. And then if you send out two rooks and they're interfacing with, the public, they don't have the training, they don't have the experience. At least if you had the experience, maybe you can gather some of that because of frequency of seeing that happen more than once. You put yourself and the officers in a grab bag toss-up situation with citizens that aren't reasonable.
The hours the 20 hours per year on average that officers have to keep their licenses includes a number of things that are mandated by the legislature. Tactical response is not included at all.
Ever.
So let me ask you this. One of the things that we're talking about is a bar situation. We're trying to see if we can implicit bias training be part of our CLE and a requirement over there with that. Why isn't tactical response? There has to be a reason why. Why isn't tactical response?
Well, Rudy, because a lot of times it's the flavor of the day. And
Yes.
so like we were required to go to how to deal with dogs, because someone shot a dog and that got everyone upset because of the circumstances behind it. So then we had to go to that type of training.
Every cop in the state will go to training on how not to shoot a dog, even though we've never forced cops to go into training about how not to shoot a human being.
Right.
Real? Is that real?
Yes,
that's what
For real.
So it's the flavor of the day, and it all comes down to money. It always comes down to whether or not those resources are being allocated.
And that's why the defund is such a bad, it's not thought through in the right way. That bad officer versus the bad policing versus taking away the dollars for the training to ensure that we have better policing. It really goes hand in hand, but no one sat down to recognize how this plays in the spectrum of what you're getting when you interface with citizens, especially.
And I think part of it too is that when you talk about what you're really trying to do, which is you're trying to look at proactive preventative measures to help make sure that we don't use law enforcement crazy concept as our backstop to clean up our messes, because those policymakers, everybody has failed what's going on here. And we're like, well, they can put Officer Doug out there. I guess he can take care of that because, we can't fix that. I mean, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to get at that. But obviously, when you're looking at trying to, something that's been played over and over again in our conversations is that when you're looking at the lack of funding or lack of training, and you're looking at things that are important that I think go hand in hand, like community policing and true community partnership, and being, as you said, Stephen, not speaking officers in an adversarial opportunity, but actually get to meet them, when literally, day-to-day operations, something like that, working from there, that makes a difference. When we had the conversation weeks ago about how an officer used to walk the beat and know what's going on over there as well.
Put the schools.
Hold on 1 second. Then we talked about how Doug talked about how just for Houston PD, that physically cannot be done because of the lack of officers. They just don't have that and a top-down opportunity to go ahead and do so. That's where I get frustrated, because we start talking about the, truly the legislature saying they want to stand up for law enforcement. They want to make a difference in these things. Put your money where your mouth is on that stuff and make a difference. Because we don't have, at a local level, we just don't have that funding. We don't have that funding with it as well. And if we're going to make something as a priority in the state, if we're truly going to try to make true systemic changing regarding law enforcement and policing, and make it for our communities, because make no mistake, these go hand in hand with our communities. There's no separation. Law enforcement isn't just on its own doing nothing by itself. The community isn't off by itself. They're copacetic and they're interchanged. If we were trying to make our communities safer and talk about these things, then we need to go ahead and work on these things and have an honest dialogue about how we fund them. Sorry, I didn't mean to go on a diatribe.
No. And what I was going to say is, you could take some of these elementary schools and middle schools and put in their curriculum that you do need to visit fire and police and understand what these emergency response and law enforcement agencies are about. Again, it would then form a pipeline possibly of people who would want to go into those professions, but it would get those folks, our children at a young age, truly understanding. Because a lot of times, just like you, Rudy, we had the talk, and all Black men, they get to talk. It would be good if you could have interfacing with law enforcement in a positive way before the talk comes. At least there can be some reference for you and me. Now, I got the reference because my grandfather was an auxiliary policeman. I got lost in first grade, and I ran into a retired El Paso policeman who then had a car drive me back home to my house.
Wait, was that first grade or first year in college?
Oh,
Rudy. Wow. You understood what I said. El Paso. I did not go to college. But again, the reason why I could initially make a call to Kevin is because the best business call was a personal call. And that allowed for us to come together to actually talk about subjects that most don't, or they get upset in a committee hearing and they don't get nearly into the weeds like we do, to look for things that we can offer, not from a political standpoint, from a best practices and a best way to keep citizens safe, no matter what ethnicity.
And Stephen, you hit something on the head that's very important. You've got to get these kids when they're young. You've got to get to them early. I helped teach a class at church with preteens because that's where they're most impressionable. You've got to get in early. We have cut the funding for every DARE program that we've ever had. They're gone. We don't have one in Houston. I don't know of any department that has them anymore. We tried a gang program, great. That didn't work out either. Those guys are gone. And Rudy, to your statement, we just had a report come out for Houston PD. In 1998, we had 5,480 officers. Today, 5,240. From 98 to today, we are 200 plus officers down from what we had in 98. It's we can't survive like that and continue to have this city grow at the rate they've grown.
And Doug, can you make sure, just for the audience to know, how much growth have you had from a population standpoint in that time period?
In the inner city, over 500,000. Outside the suburbs that are coming in, we're probably at another 4 million. I mean, we will be the third largest city very shortly.
It's amazing. I just have to say this, and then we're going to have to shut it down for the day. 70 million contacts every year between law enforcement and our citizens. Given the constricts, given the lack of funding, the lack of leadership, the lack of resources, it's amazing what a great job our law enforcement officers do day in and day out across this country. We're not saying they don't make mistakes. We're not saying they don't get it wrong. We're not saying there aren't bad cops out there, but it's amazing how good of a job they do already. We're all about making it better, getting better at the job, making improvements where we can. But our law enforcement officers deserve credit for what a great job they do right now.
Yeah, defunding and disbanding needs to really be revisited and dealt with in a way that I think, you know, the decision makers that have been elected, I don't think they've gotten into the real story of how this works. It's too reactionary, and it's going to continue to get people hurt.
Yes, sir.
Unfortunately.
I'm going to make a suggestion. If we're going to continue to advertise, we're going to start this thing at 10 o'clock. I say we start getting together at 1:45 so we can try
that.
live by
Fair
10.
enough. Fair enough.
Well, how about we look at 9:45 next Wednesday, and then we'll look to be going live by 10 o'clock.
Perfect.
Sounds great.
Sounds good.
That's good, buddy.
Thank you,
Oh,
guys.
wait,
Again, congratulations.
Yes, Doug.
Wednesday's a holiday.
Oh yeah, it's Veterans Day, so let's make it 2 weeks.
Okay, 2 weeks from today.
Done. Got it.
All right.
Thanks, gentlemen. Y'all have a good one.
Congratulations, council member, again.
Yes, sir.
Thanks,
Congrats.
y'all. I appreciate
Hey,
it.
and good luck to you, Stephen.
Oh, yes, yes,
Mr.
yes.
President.
Yeah, for president-elect, no doubt right there. And
I'm telling you.
yeah, there you go.
No, we need to run Steve for something else.
I'm with you on that. You got our support.
I appreciate it. Thank you. I will consider
buddy.
all thought. Thanks again. Have a great day. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.